All right, welcome everyone. We are here for our second installment of Ask the Expert when it comes to thinking about either our optional themes in TOK or our areas of knowledge. We're here with Mr. Coen. He has probably forgotten more history than I will know. So he is the most qualified person that we could talk to about how to think about knowledge, at least as it relates to history. So my first question for you, Mr. Coen. What methods do historians use to gain knowledge?
So the methods used by historians and widely known is just to gather as much information as you can that we know of, whether it's a primary source or a secondary source or any sort of artifacts that would help to kind of put the puzzle pieces together to try to figure out what happened and what's the most accurate view of this event. I kind of relate it to my students as being almost like a detective to try to figure out all the details. You don't come to an assumption yet. You don't come to a conclusion yet, but it's kind of like the gathering of information and say, okay, let's lay this all out. Now let's look at these little pieces and how they fit into the big picture of the event. Before somebody can actually come to the conclusion, you have to make sure that you have all the information, and it's not like a hurried process. It's a time you have to take time to think about each of those pieces of information, whether it's a primary source, who wrote it, when they wrote it, is it valuable, is it reliable, to start putting the puzzle pieces together to try to create the best possible picture and or conclusion of what happened in history.
Yeah, so what you touched on there is one of the reasons why history is its own standalone area of knowledge, right? Like if we think about the breakdown of the subjects in the diploma program, history is in group 3, which is called individuals and societies. And it's lumped in with all of these other courses that we are technically human sciences, right? So history is its own sort of area of knowledge because we can't go back and do some kind of experiment on the past.
Exactly.
Whereas with psychology or economics or sociology, we can do an experiment in the here and now. We can't really do that with history. Um, okay, my next question for you. You're doing great.
Yeah, good. Just happy to help you guys, your class there.
If it is difficult to establish proof in history, does that mean that all versions of history are equally acceptable?
Well, I don't know. Proof is a tough word here in my discipline. To have definite proof is something that you search for, but it's only used in, like my answer earlier, which is all of the evidence lining up, and the majority of historians thinking that certain way. When you're looking at proof, you have to examine many different factors. You have to examine the perspective of the event. You have to examine who wrote the piece of evidence that you have. But when you come up with a conclusion of an event, usually it's the majority of proven historians or proven thought process uh, that you arrive at an answer. I wouldn't say proof is very tough in some cases in history to have 100% no doubt. Here's the answer. Here's how you should be looking at this event, because there's always something that could maybe contradict it or have a different perspective of an event or historical figure or a motive, or the bias perspective is thrown around in my class, but I always say you can't just whip out the B word. You have to explain the B word, all right? Because bias is my year one students, they kind of develop these the process of thinking, instead of just saying, oh well, the author's bias. Well, why? And then let's break it down. So proof, is a tough word in history, because once again, to find something to have 100% proven fact, it's rare, I would say. So you have to keep thinking about things as a historian, which is an unbiased perspective. You got to pull yourself out of the event and say, okay, how do we view this, and what evidence do we have, and then do we have enough proof to create one conclusion, or are there multiple answers or multiple conclusions or perspectives?
So I think this question kind of hints at the problem of, and maybe even the value of revisionist history, to go back and have another look at the evidence and come up with a new narrative. That's kind of a slippery slope, right? I mean, what
Yeah.
why does revisionist history get practiced, and what is a problem with it?
So there are some issues now with a little bit more of revisionist history because of items that come up. We have Hollywood films that have a little bit of influence on the population and students in my classes. They'll ask questions about, it doesn't matter who the director is. I don't want to get into those things, but the fact is that there are items that a producer or a director might want to become light of or throw in a movie that could definitely put a wrench in some people's proven history perspectives. So it's kind of a tough road to walk down into the revisionist history. Now, it's great to think about them. It's great to understand and try to say, okay, well, why do they think this way? But once again, you got to go back to the historian perspective, which is you can't put yourself in there already assuming or already coming up with a conclusion unless you look back at the evidence, like we talked about in the first question that you asked me. So, revisionist history could be interesting at times, and it's something that you could be, hey, this is a great hypothetical question, and it's a great discussion question in a coffee house. But the fact is that it could throw a wrench in people's kind of idea of the proof that you were talking about earlier. So you have to just slow down and not get to that revisionist historian and use that and confuse that. That's a better word, confuse with fact. So like I said, it's a great spark for not only what I teach, which is history and which I love, but the fact is that sometimes when you go down the road of revisionist history, it can get murky.
So speaking of the B word, can the
Yes.
historian be free of bias in the selection and interpretation of material?
So I try to help my students be aware of the B word in my class as being a biased perspective. A true historian would probably not have a biased perspective in their conclusion and their gathering of evidence. However, we know that we're human and we bring in a little bit of our own perspectives. We just have to make sure we slow down and not have those assumptions immediately instead of saying, okay, well, let's find out more about this perspective. Or, and it's very tough with politics, it's very tough with religion, it's very tough with culture sometimes to step outside of your own ideals and say, okay, well, why did they feel this way? Why did they protest this way? Why did they, react this way? But until you slow down and understand their perspective, then you can say, okay, well, that's why they did that, or why that's why we should do this as a society. And that's why you can accept different possibilities of answers. That's why, your earlier question about the proof, once again, very seldom in history do we have a 100% answer to, why did President Truman drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Okay, we can debate, we can talk. You can talk about how, it might have saved lives, but the fact is that once again, when you throw in your own perspective of maybe your country or maybe your allies, Axis versus Allied powers, you have to think that you have to step outside these thoughts and then try to think about them critically as a historian instead of a person in the world who already has ideals in society. So that's a tough thing to do, I would say.
Yeah. So it seems like you're saying a really common type of bias in studying history is like the idea of presentism, when you take the beliefs that people have today, or even your own beliefs, and look back on a time period with that sort of lens, and that can be problematic.
Exactly. So, we're an IB school. We have students from all over the world in our classes. We have to make sure that you slow down and, actually our class in my IB history here at Windermere Preparatory School is a 20th century world history class. The options that we have sat down and chose for our student population line up for success on the exam. But the fact is that being a world school, we still sometimes kind of think wherever the school was, and maybe it's a U.S. perspective immediately, instead of I say, guys, slow down. This is a world history class technically, so you have to think like, a little bit more broad perspective than just US, 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 US. And it happens sometimes, but I think the year two students finally develop the skill and say, okay, I'm not going to think of it or write this essay on this perspective. I'm going to slow down and I'm going to write from these perspectives. And that should be on the mark scheme. And that's how I'm going to have a successful essay on the IB exam.
So you must have done some homework and you read ahead here, because that partially answers the next question. You got 3 of 5 questions done, so you're more than halfway here. How can we gauge the extent to which history is being told from a national perspective? So how do we know that?
Exactly. So I kind of touched upon it earlier without even thinking about it, but the questions that you have here are pretty good, but it goes back to trying to figure out the historical event and the perspective of it from a global perspective instead of just where you are. It's easy to look at what your country's perspective or your background or heritage, and like I said, political and religious issues are tough to sometimes step outside the box and say, okay, I'm going to leave these on the side, I'm going to come back to those. Let's look at all that information in history. What do we have? What's reputable? What kind of primary sources? What kind of speeches? What kind of evidence? What kind of artifacts do we have before we actually come to a conclusion on this event or this historical figure's influence on history? But you have to create some sort of global perspective. And the last question that I do sometimes at the end of the unit is, okay, we just studied this unit. Now, how does this influence the world? How does it influence world history? Are strikes happening in labor unions? How does this influence the world and catching on to this and saying, hey, we agree with them? Or do they say, hey, this is just a small minority of people? Those are the parts of being unbiased and having a global perspective on events rather than just jumping to conclusions immediately and saying, okay, well, this is what they thought or this is how they felt in a historical event. It's pretty hard to do, once again.
Yeah. So if we were going to study the history of the decision to drop the atomic bomb, we should probably use more sources besides just US-based sources.
So yeah, I mean, you're talking about Truman. Truman's just going to say, I dropped the atomic bomb, 1, because we thought Germany would have dropped it if they had it, 2, if we're going to save American lives by a mainland invasion. But you forget that there are many more effects on, number 1, civilians, number 2, radiation, lasting effects. And that is another perspective that you have to talk about. And you can't just jump on one and say, that's it. You have to say, well, wait a minute here. Now we can look at hindsight and say whether that was as successful as we thought it was at the time, but the decisions in history influence the future. So the global perspective is key for people to view instead of just skip over and just say, these are my views, I'm very close-minded. No, you have to open your mind up to other options and listen to different perspectives and learn about different perspectives. And I actually, in my class, it's interesting because a student wants to be in a group where I might have a debate or an organized debate. And sometimes it's better to learn from the opposite end and the other side, because you learn more than if you just stay to your own values and your ideas of preconceived notions or assumptions going into an event.
Okay, last one. This is
All right.
an easy one. We're gonna end on an easy one. Fastball down the middle here.
Yeah.
On what criteria can a historian evaluate the reliability of their sources?
All right. So in IB history, we have 4 words that are actually up on the board: origin, purpose, value, limitation. These are OPVL. That's what we call it as the lingo in the class. So if you take a look at the origin of the source, all right, who wrote it, when they wrote it, and what time period did they write it as well. That's an interesting perspective because it can persuade a reader or an audience in different ways. So that's the first one: origin. Where is it from? Who wrote it? What time period was it from? Okay, that's kind of laying it out on the table. If you think about, like, you dig up a dinosaur and you put down the pieces and you're like brushing them off and you're ready to go. That's like step 1. Step 2 is purpose. All right. Why did this author write this? All right. What are they trying to give, or what kind of message are they trying to give to an audience or the people to figure out a glimpse of what happened, or this historical figure's perspective. The third one is value. Why is it valuable to you as an unbiased historian in my class trying to figure out what the most common perspective of a historian would be about an event or a historical figure's influence on the unit that we study? So value is is how does it relate, and is it related to the topic, or is it just a side piece of information that goes off on a tangent? And then the last one is the hardest one, that usually by year 2 students really can analyze: limitations. It's like putting a document or a primary source under a microscope and trying to critique it and say, okay, what are some problems that we could find out about this document? Is this 100% reliable? Is it, something that they're trying to persuade? And you also have to think about audience. If there's a difference between a primary source that's a speech to the public, whereas you can see a memoir or a closed conference or secret meeting between people, because people are more open to speaking their mind, and or more honest sometimes if you find a primary document on a memoir, rather than a public speech trying to persuade the public and trying to feel or unite them on a certain topic, whether it's the Great Depression, like FDR's fireside chats, which were very interesting, but he was trying to unite the people against this problem, and say, we're in this together, people. But you also have to think about the reliability of when it is, how it's being broadcasted, and who the audience is. A limitation could also be when it was written. All right, if you're a World War One soldier and you wrote a memoir or a book about 100 years later, and you were late in your life, the details could be, hard to remember. So you have to take into account all kinds of different things in trying to look at that document under the microscope and say whether this is a solid document, a reliable document, or if it's just, helping assist you in trying to come to that final conclusion of the event.
So it sounds like that last step is where students would try to control for some bias.
Exactly. And I think the first few months of IB history year 1, when we do OPVL activities on a source or a document, just to say it's biased isn't enough. So you have to explore why, and then you have to explain it not only to me, but also the IB, to show that you are a true historian and you can work through the process of analyzing primary sources, secondary sources, and say, okay, this is what one weakness may be if you are trying to find the answer related to the unit of study.
Okay, cool. All right, Mr. Coen, you are off the hot seat. You've done well.
I love it.
You've given some good ideas about sort of the problems in trying to study history. So hopefully this shows up in some good essays and maybe even in your classroom as well.
It's good.
All right.
That's it. All right. We'll see you guys. Have a good day.